Hello everyone, welcome back to AS Biology with Dr. Demi. I am Dr. Demi, and in today's video I will take you through chapter 9, which is gas exchange and smoking. So if you haven't watched any of the previous videos and you would like to revise or just maybe have some pre-exposure to any content you might be learning at your school, please check out the other videos and I'm sure they will help you prepare better for any topic that you're yet to learn. So let's get into it. This is the 9th chapter. After this, there will be only 2 chapters left, and that would be the end of my recordings for this channel. But let's see how far we can get with this one today. All right, so what does the human gas exchange do? So you've heard of the gas exchange system, and I'm sure when you think about that, you think of oxygen, you think of carbon dioxide. But what exactly is the system that is responsible for the transport of these gases? The system is what we call the gas exchange system, and what it does is that it links the circulatory system, which we discussed in chapter 8, to the atmosphere. So remember when we were discussing chapter 8, we said that the blood is responsible for transporting oxygen because it has red blood cells which have hemoglobin, and hemoglobin in turn will bind to oxygen, and oxygen is something that we breathe in from the atmosphere. The gas exchange system is the one that actually provides the link between the blood and the atmosphere. It also helps to warm the air that enters the body during breathing. It maximizes the surface area for the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the atmosphere. It minimizes the diffusion distance and obviously helps to maintain the concentration gradient for the diffusion of gases. So just an introductory note that you have to know is that as human beings, we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. On the other hand, plants will take in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. And so you can call that the great circle of life if you're a fan of the Lion King. So how do unicellular and multicellular organisms differ in terms of gas exchange? With unicellular organisms, they don't have any form of sophisticated system that allows them to exchange gases with the atmosphere. And so sometimes they simply absorb and release gases through their skin. Whereas with multicellular organisms, just like we are, we have a very distinct system that enables us to be able to achieve that. Now this here is a drawing of what the gas exchange system looks like. If you're using a different syllabus, this might be called the respiratory system, and this is it over here. You can see that the respiratory system or the gas exchange system is housed within your chest, and it consists of things like your lungs. It consists of what we call the alveoli. It consists of a bronchiole. It has a trachea, which is what you call your windpipe, and I'm sure you've encountered a couple of accidents with your windpipe if you're a person who likes to talk while you eat, because sometimes when you're taking food, it doesn't go down your throat, it goes down your windpipe instead, and in such cases you would find that people are choking on their food. So the windpipe is what leads over here, and you can see that it divides into 2, and it divides into what we call the bronchus. So that's the bronchus over there, and when it splits into the bronchus then go on to form what we call the bronchioles. So you can see those are like the tiny networks over there. Those are the bronchioles, but there are other parts such as the lungs that we still need to learn, so we will go into that in detail. Something else that you need to see is that these little networks, when you expand them, you find that you have your bronchiole, like the respiratory bronchiole, the terminal bronchiole, and then they come into these bubbles over here, or what we can say are bubble-like structures, and these are called the alveoli. When you're speaking of only one, you refer to it as the alveolus. So I'm just going to write that out so that you don't get confused in case you see this word. This is simply a singular word for alveoli. Now, these are some of the parts that you need to remember. For example, the lungs are in the chest cavity. They're surrounded by the pleural membranes, and they're ventilated by the movement of the diaphragm and the ribs. So if, for example, you're in a very stressful situation and you go to see a wellness counselor, you might find that you're asked to take deep breaths or to do a breathing exercise. And so when you breathe in, you feel that your chest expands and your ribs are lifted up, and that means that oxygen is being taken into your lungs, so they are swelling out. up, and when you breathe out, which is when you're releasing carbon dioxide, you find that your ribs come downwards, and then your lungs will collapse. So that's simply to tell you that the movement of the ribs and the diaphragm help to ventilate the lungs. You also have the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles, which I just showed you on the previous video, on the previous slide, sorry. The trachea is a pipe that basically goes from the throat to the lungs, and it is very close to your esophagus. Your esophagus is your throat, and that's why sometimes it's very easy for you to make a mistake and put a food in your windpipe, and that of course can be very dangerous because some people die from choking on their food. And at the end of the trachea, so if we were to draw it, we can say that the trachea looks something like this, and at the end of a trachea you have these two branches. One goes to the left and the other one goes to the right, and we call these the bronchi. And the bronchi then split into different trees. So you can see over there, they become like more trees, and those become the bronchioles. So each bronchus, bronchi is the similar word, singular word, and in is the plural word, sorry, and the singular word is bronchus. So each bronchus would form bronchioles, and you have smooth muscles around the bronchioles that relax or contract to allow air to reach the alveoli. Now the alveoli are simply made up of elastic fibers, and they can expand or recoil, so they also play a role in how the lungs are expanding. So when the alveoli are fully expanded, that means that there's an increased surface area for the diffusion of air, and you have blood capillaries that flow very close to the alveoli. And what happens is that these blood capillaries would carry oxygenated blood, and they're able to release oxygen from that blood because they're very close to the alveoli. They're able to release oxygen into the alveoli so that you're able to get oxygen around your body. Now, how do we warm and clean air? So something to bear in mind, first of all, is that air is not always clean. If you live in a highly polluted city, then there's a high chance that the air that you're breathing has a lot of dust. It has sand, pollens, it has fungal spores, it has bacteria and viruses. And that is why sometimes just by walking into a certain space, you might find yourself having an allergic reaction. That is because the air is not always as clean as we would like it to be. And sometimes in these days, simply because of the impact of agriculture, you might find that air also carries pesticide molecules, which can also affect your breathing. These molecules, when air is taken in through the nose, so always remember that you breathe in air through the nose, and it is safer to do so than to breathe in air through your mouth. The reason for that is that the nose has what we call the nose hairs. So those tiny hairs that are in your nose that you might feel like, oh my goodness, these don't look attractive. Some people actually shave them off, try to remove them. They have a function. They're not just there for the sake of it. They help to trap the things like dust, like pollens, and keep them from getting into your respiratory system, so getting down to your chest where they might cause an irritation. So they're usually trapped by those nose hairs, and sometimes they're also trapped by the mucus lining in the nasal passages. So in your nose, sometimes I don't know if you've noticed, but if you walk into a place where the air is a little bit sketchy, you start to find that your nose is very itchy, and before you know it, you're producing a lot of mucus and you feel the need to blow out your nose. The point of the mucus is that it is creating a thick environment whereby the molecules such as the sand, pollens, the fungal spores are unable to diffuse through the nose down the trachea to the lungs. So it traps them there so that they are unable to move down and create an infection. So mucus are made by what we call the goblet cells, and mucus is simply made up of mucin, which consists of glycoproteins. What these glycoproteins do is that they have carbohydrate chains. If you remember from chapter 2, or was it chapter 4 rather, when we were discussing cell membrane structure, we mentioned glycoproteins, and we said they're simply proteins that have a carbohydrate chain. So these carbohydrate chains enable them to become sticky, and because they are sticky, they're able to trap any particles that should not be in the body. And what would then happen is that once these particles have been trapped, the phagocytic white blood cells, and we will learn more about them in chapter 11, so don't stress too much if they sound very odd now, but phagocytes, if you remember from cell membranes and transport again, are simply able to engulf materials that are not wanted. So phagocytic white blood cells are engulfing white blood cells, and what they do is that they're able to scavenge all the molecules that are not needed within the body and trap them so that they don't cause an infection. Even if it's a bacteria, if your immune system is very responsive, it is able to detect the bacteria very quickly and able to trap it, engulf it by using the phagocytes so that it doesn't create an infection within the body. So, to the fun part, which I believe many people enjoy, what is smoking? What is in tobacco smoke? Why is it such a big deal? So, I mean, if you're watching this video in 2020, 2021, or basically any time after that, you will realize or you will remember that there have been a lot of reports about vaping, which is an alternative form of smoking. People use vaping chemicals and they use vape pens, and there have been a lot of stories that claim that people have died from vaping due to the chemicals in the vaping pen or whatever it is that they're smoking. In the same way, tobacco smoke can be very deadly because it has over 4,000 chemicals in it, and there is mainstream smoke that comes to you from the mouth end, and also side stream smoke from the burning end. So it means when you're holding a cigarette in your hands, the part where you have lit up the cigarette, which is the end that is not in your mouth, is called the burning end, and the part that goes in your mouth is called the mouth end. But whichever way, all of these chemicals are carried around in the smoke, and there's a higher concentration of harmful compounds in the side stream end. So usually if you're sitting around a person who smokes, you will find that you just inhaling all of those cigarettes can also create health implications for you and predispose you to some of the diseases we are going to be looking at in this chapter. And you sitting around smoking, if you're not a smoker, is what we call passive smoking. So passive smoking is when you are not a smoker yourself, but you end up inhaling smoke from other people's smoking activities. This image here is of a boy in Indonesia who has now been rehabilitated, but he was a very young boy, and I think at some point he was smoking about 2 packets of cigarettes a day because he had become hooked. And that's another thing about smoking, the fact that it becomes very addictive and then becomes very difficult for those who have taken the habit to drop it. Now, what are the main components of cigarette smoke? You have what we call tar. So if you live in a place where all the roads are tarred, or if you've ever seen road tarring in progress, you will notice that there is this black paint-like structure that is poured over the tarred roads to make them look very nice and glossy and beautiful. Part of that is actually tar. Tar is a very dangerous compound, and it's derived from petrochemicals. So when you're looking at this image that I have put here, it's simply to let you know that tar would look something like this, and it's very close to what you would find in crude oil. And you also have carcinogens. So when we say a carcinogen, that means that something that causes cancer, and there are lots of them in a cigarette. This here is an image of a diseased lung, because what happens when people smoke is that tar gets deposited over the surface of the lungs, and when it gets deposited over the surface of the lungs, it obviously blocks the space for proper diffusion or exchange of gases. And once that happens, you find that some people will smoke, struggle with breathing, they're unable to breathe properly, or they breathe heavily when they're anywhere, simply because they're trying to get as much air as possible into their bodies. They also tend to open their mouths when they breathe, and some of them tend to develop a croaky voice. You also have carbon monoxide in cigarette smoke. Now, if you recall from the last chapter, I had mentioned that carbon monoxide is very deadly because it can bind to hemoglobin irreversibly, which means that if it binds to your hemoglobin, it is unable to detach itself, or rather hemoglobin is unable to detach itself from carbon monoxide, and that means that it would not be able to transport enough oxygen through the body. And if it's unable to do that, then obviously all of your organs, all of your systems are in jeopardy, and so carbon monoxide is a very dangerous chemical to be around. You also get carbon monoxide from the burning of petrochemicals. So if you're sitting in your car and you're driving down down the street, you're basically releasing some form of carbon monoxide into the atmosphere. You also have nicotine, which is a very big component of cigarette smoke and has been found to be one of the addictive substances in cigarettes. And so when people want to quit smoking, they usually go to a therapist or a doctor and get what we call a nicotine patch. And what the nicotine patch does is that it stays on their shoulder and releases little amounts of nicotine into their blood so that they don't go and take a cigarette to satisfy their desires. Instead, it's given to them through a patch until they're able to leave smoking completely and detach from it as a habit. Tar damages the gas exchange system, while carbon monoxide and nicotine will damage the cardiovascular system. So something else about smokers is that in some cases they tend to have very high heart rates, which can be very dangerous for their health. Now, this is just an image I like to show my students in the classroom to let them understand how respiratory diseases are distributed across the world. So the darker the shade of blue, the more the respiratory disease death in the country. And this is from 2016 by our World in Data. And you can see there that it seems to be a lot less, but in some areas it is quite concentrated. Some of the known diseases of the lungs are chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and lung cancer. And these are usually caused by things like air pollution, smoking, and also just having allergic reactions. But obviously smoking would most likely predispose you to any one of these three diseases very easily. So it is just my own little thing, my own little lesson: don't smoke. There's not much to be gained from it. So I just want to show you an image here of something that you would find, or you might find in the exam, you might encounter. Usually when questions are asked about gas exchange, there's usually a black and white image, and they tell you to identify which cells are which. So one thing you would need to be able to identify are these tiny projections over here that you find on the cell. These are called the cilia. Right, so they're like tiny hair projections. That's an A. They're like tiny hair projections that you would find on the cell. These are the mucous cells, or in some you can also refer to them as the goblet cells, because the goblet cells are the ones that make mucus. And something else you need to know is that the cilia help to sweep away excess mucus, because if mucus is too much, that can create a problem. What you would call a cell that has cilia would simply be ciliated. I hope that the way I'm trying to draw this with the mouse looks clear to you. You typically call them ciliated cells. So just start to point those out to you in case you're doing a past practice paper and you encounter them. But obviously these are not the only kinds of questions that you would see. Just saying that this is something that you might encounter in the exam. So when we look at the lung diseases, it will become important why you should know which cells are which. So chronic bronchitis is the first cell we're going to look at. And as you can see already from this image, there's this over here that has a very wide lumen, and you have one that has a very narrow lumen. So what happens when people smoke is that the tar from the cigarette, which we've already discussed, has that consistency of crude oil, stimulates the production of more mucus by the goblet cells. So remember that mucus is often secreted when something foreign enters the airways. The point of that is that the mucus is trying to trap whatever harmful chemical is there so that it doesn't cause any damage to the body. So the more a person smokes, the more mucus will be produced, because the chemicals in cigarette smoke are very harmful to the body. But what the tar would do is that it would prevent the ciliated cells from basically cleaning the airway. So that it would prevent them, for example, from sweeping away the excess mucus that might be produced, because the tar sits on those cells. So think of the cells as like tiny hairs, and now you put like a blob of crude oil on them, or even just vegetable oil. The point of it is that they would not be able to move as well, because they would be sitting under the weight of this oil, and as a result of that they'd become very weak. And what then happens is that the excess mucus will start to block the bronchioles. So chronic bronchitis is basically a disease of the bronchioles. So the excess mucus will start to block the bronchioles, and you then have things like bacteria, dirt, viruses that are able to find their way down there, simply because the mucus is mixing with them. It's so much mucus that's being produced, and that causes further blockage. Now, when you have a lot of bacteria, they start to form what we call a biofilm, and that just creates a lot of problems. And this is what causes what we call the smoker's cough. So if you've been around a person who smokes, you would have noticed that they have a very distinct cough that sounds dry yet not too dry for some reason, and you can see that you can feel that it sounds painful. It feels like their throats are becoming more hollow. That's usually a result of bronchitis or bronchitis in progress. The smooth muscle that are surrounding the bronchioles will also become thicker, and that makes the airways narrow. And when the airways are narrow, it simply means that there isn't enough surface area for oxygen to diffuse, and that makes breathing very difficult. And so the people who have chronic bronchitis, they tend to have a very severe cough, and they produce a lot of phlegm. So you find that it's not a dry cough yet. It just sounds very hollow. I'm not sure how to explain it. Okay, you also have another condition called emphysema, and emphysema is a very deadly condition. It's a condition where there is less oxygen that's absorbed into the blood, and again, it is caused by smoking. So what smoking does is that it causes inflammation. Every time you take something into your body that is harmful, it causes an inflammatory response, and wherever there is an inflammation, the body will send phagocytes. So remember, the phagocytes are immune cells that help to engulf any foreign material so that it doesn't damage the body. Sometimes when a foreign material gets into your body, what that foreign material does is cause inflammation, and so the phagocytes are the ones that respond to inflammation. So what the phagocytes will then do once smoking causes this inflammation is that they will go and line the airways, which means they line the lungs and the bronchioles, the bronchi, and so on, and they release a protein digesting enzyme called elastase. Now remember, when we started discussing the alveoli, we said that the alveoli is made up of elastic fibers. Now elastase that has been released by the phagocytes will start to break down the elastic walls of the alveoli, because the phagocytes are trying as much as possible to get into the alveoli to remove whatever is causing the infection. But in the process of doing that, they release elastase, and elastase simply starts to chew into the walls, the elastic walls of the alveoli. And once the elastic walls are damaged, by the way, the elastic walls are made up of elastin. Once the elastic walls are damaged, it means that the alveoli cannot expand as they should and cannot collapse as they should when you're breathing. So that means that there would not be enough air in the in the respiratory system, because there isn't sufficient expansion and sufficient recoiling, and so air sits in the alveoli but it doesn't really move anywhere, and that causes a reduction in the surface area for gas exchange. So if you look here, this is what a healthy alveoli looks like, right? You can see that it's well covered, but when elastase has worked on it, because the phagocytes are trying to get to the site of infection, you can see then that it has like these holes, and obviously the more holes you have, the less elastic it's going to be. Also think of it in terms of a balloon. If you punch a hole in a balloon, that balloon would not be able to expand. Even if you place your finger over it and you're able to blow some air into it, you notice very quickly that it collapses without being able to hold enough air. And so that just reduces surface area for gas exchange in people who have this condition. The last condition is lung cancer, and lung cancer has been responsible for quite a number of deaths. If you've been watching some historical documentaries, you will see that there was a lot of smoking back in the day, and quite a number of people died from smoking because they had been addicted and they didn't know how to stop, and as a result of that, they developed cancer. The tar in tobacco also contains carcinogens, which is not surprising, because if you think of the fact that crude oil itself contains certain compounds that can stimulate the formation of cancers, then it makes sense that tar in tobacco would also cause carcinogens, and that can affect the DNA. And the thing with lung cancer most of the time is that people don't know when it's developing. It takes about 20 to 30 years to develop, but the growth of the tumor would happen without any symptoms. So people would usually have a well-advanced stage of lung cancer before they are aware that they have developed it. And when lung cancer is fully developed, you can see that people cough up things like like blood because their tissues are being damaged. It's a very horrendous disease, not something to wish on anyone, but please, as much as possible, do not smoke, because this is a very possible outcome for people who smoke. So, how does smoking affect the cardiovascular system? So remember that we said that besides tar and carcinogens in smoking, we also have nicotine and carbon monoxide. Nicotine is like a drug. It's easily absorbed by the blood. It travels to the brain. It's like what causes the brain to just feel addicted to this substance. But what it also does is that it reduces the diameter of the arterioles. So remember that in the circulatory system, we have the arteries, they become arterioles, which are basically smaller, but now it reduces their diameter even further. And if the diameter in the arterioles are reduced, then that means that blood pressure will increase, because it's traveling through a smaller space. And so when blood pressure increases, it means that the blood supply to the extremities would decrease, because at the extremities, as much as possible, we don't want high pressure there. It also stimulates adrenaline unnecessarily, because when people smoke, they start to become, a bit more active. They have like a fight or flight response even when they shouldn't have that, and it increases the risk of them developing blood clots. Then you have carbon monoxide, which again, like I said, will combine with hemoglobin and reduce the transportation of oxygen. It also damages the walls of the arteries, and it can cause stroke or coronary heart disease. So it's a very, very serious chemical, and not one that you would want to have in your body. This here is just where I'm going to end off, but this is just to show you what a smoker's lung looks like in real life. This is from a YouTube video, and when I tried to find the link again, I saw that the video had been taken down. But this is what a normal lung looks like over here. You can see that it's nice and red. It's being fed by blood vessels. It looks very healthy. But you can see here, this is what a smoker's lung would look like. It is covered with tar. And in this video, what this lady was trying to do was to pump up the lung, and you could see that the lung with the smoker's lung rather was unable to just collapse as it should and expand as it should, whereas the healthy lung did that quite well. So this is where I am going to end chapter 9 for today. Please always make sure you look at your textbooks after you've watched this video or before you've watched the videos, so that you're able to follow better, because again, there would be some information in the textbooks that are not in the videos. I hope you have enjoyed this video. Have a good time. Until the next chapter, goodbye.